She had exactly 3 days. 3 days before he arrived, 3 days to finish what she'd been quietly building for months, in secret, in silence, behind a grieving face that nobody thought to question. And then his truck rolled through the gate one morning early, dust rising behind it like a warning, and everything she had planned was suddenly on a razor's edge. The widow, the rancher, and a piece of land that one of them would do absolutely anything to own. Here's what I need you to think about before this story begins. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room completely certain they had already won, and you knew something they didn't? That feeling, that quiet, dangerous knowledge, is exactly what carries this entire story forward. A woman who everyone assumed was broken, a man who mistook her grief for weakness, and a plan she had been building brick by careful brick while the whole town looked the other way. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, and if you've ever had to play small while thinking big, this one is going to hit different. Like the video, subscribe if you're new, and let's get into it. The Callaway spread sat 12 miles outside of a small Wyoming town called Morrow Flats. And if you've never been to a place like Morrow Flats, let me paint it for you. It's the kind of town where the gas station doubles as the post office on Tuesdays, where everyone knows the name of your truck before they know your last name, where the wind comes off the mountains with a particular kind of cold that doesn't care what month it is. It just arrives, and you adjust or you leave. Most people in Morrow Flats had adjusted. Generation after generation, they had pressed themselves into that landscape and let it shape them the way rivers shape stone, slowly, permanently, without asking permission. Harriet Callaway was shaped by it more than most. She had been born 39 years ago in the back bedroom of the very house she still lived in. Her father, a quiet man named August who smelled of pine resin and black coffee, had ranched that land his whole life and handed it to her and her husband, Edmund, the day they married. August was gone now, had been gone 6 years, but Harriet still heard him sometimes in the sound the fence posts made when the wind pressed against them, a low, stubborn groan, unmoved. Edmund had been gone for 14 months. Heart attack, the doctor said, sudden, no warning. He was 44 years old and had been perfectly healthy the week before, and then one Tuesday morning in early October, he simply didn't come in from the barn. Harriet had found him herself, face down in the frost-stiff grass between the water trough and the fence line. His hat had blown 6 feet away. She remembered thinking, in that strange, suspended moment before everything collapsed inside her, that she needed to get his hat before it got any dirtier. The town grieved with her, the way small towns do, casseroles and quiet knocks on the door, and people standing in her kitchen saying things that meant well and landed soft. She thanked them all. She held herself together at the funeral with a stillness that made people uncomfortable, because grief that quiet feels like something is wrong. People prefer crying. It reassures them. Harriet didn't cry, not in public, not where anyone could fold it into a story about her. What she did, in the weeks and months that followed, was think. She thought about the land, 400 acres of mixed-use ranch property, sitting on top of something she hadn't told a living soul about. Not yet. Edmund had known, because Edmund had been the one to find it, a geological survey he'd paid for himself quietly 2 years before he died, after a conversation with an old hydrologist named Percy who passed through Morrow Flats one autumn and mentioned, almost casually, that the aquifer formations in this particular valley corridor were unusually significant, undervalued, misunderstood. Edmund had paid for the survey. He'd read the results. He'd tucked the document into the false bottom of his grandfather's roll-top desk, and he'd told Harriet about it on a cold February night over coffee, his voice careful and low, like he was discussing something sacred. "We're sitting on something, Harriet. Something real. We just have to figure out what to do with it." He died 8 months later, without ever figuring it out. But Harriet had kept thinking. And what she had been building, quietly and methodically over the past 5 months, was a plan, a legal, intricate, carefully constructed plan that would transform what was under that land into a resource development agreement with a regional water authority, one that would secure the ranch financially for the next 50 years and ensure it could never be broken up and sold off piece by piece. She had been working with a water rights attorney named Sylvia in Cheyenne, who drove up once a month and sat with Harriet at the kitchen table with documents spread between them like a map of something that hadn't been discovered yet. She had been working with a land trust consultant named Boone, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had seen arrangements like this done and undone across 3 states and knew exactly which knots needed tying. She had been gathering signatures, filing preliminary paperwork, building a structure that would hold. She was 3 days from submitting the final application package. 3 days. And then, on a Thursday morning in early April, while Harriet was standing at the kitchen window with her second cup of coffee, watching the light come up gold over the east pasture, she saw a truck she didn't recognize come through the gate at the bottom of the long gravel drive. A black truck, new, moving with the particular slow confidence of someone who already considers themselves on their own property. Harriet set her coffee cup down very carefully on the counter. She knew that truck. She didn't know it personally, had never seen that specific vehicle before, but she knew the kind of truck. She knew the silhouette of the man behind the wheel before he even stepped out. His name was Crawford Lyle, and he had been circling her land for months. Crawford Lyle was 51 years old and had spent the better part of 3 decades acquiring land across 4 Wyoming counties in the way that certain men acquire things, not because they needed it exactly, but because the not having of it made them restless in a way they couldn't name. He was not by any technical measure a villain. He paid fair market value more often than not. He didn't forge documents or bribe officials, at least not in any way that had ever been proven. He was what people in Morrow Flats would call, with a tight-lipped neutrality, a serious operator, which meant he was effective, he was relentless, and you did not want to be on the other side of a negotiation from him unless you had done your homework. Most people hadn't done their homework. Crawford stood 6'2" and carried himself like a man who had never once been told no and accepted it gracefully. He had steel grey hair he kept short, hands that were still working hands despite the wealth, and a smile that appeared exactly when he needed it to and disappeared just as fast. His ranch, the Lyle Consolidated Holdings, which covered over 18,000 acres in 2 counties, was the biggest private land operation in the region. He ran cattle, leased grazing rights, and had recently begun positioning himself in water access conversations in a way that a few people in state government had noticed but nobody had formally challenged. He had first approached Harriet 6 months ago. A letter formally typed on company letterhead, an offer to purchase the Callaway, spread at a price that was, she had to admit, above standard market value. She had not responded. A second letter came 4 weeks later. Same offer, slightly increased. She filed it in the roll-top desk. Then came a phone call, his assistant, not Crawford himself, which told her something about how he categorized her at that stage. The assistant was polite and professional and mentioned that Mr. Lyle was prepared to be quite generous given the widow's circumstances. The widow's circumstances. Harriet had hung up without saying goodbye. After that, there were intermediaries. A real estate agent she didn't know, a man named Pruitt from Casper, who showed up at her door in April with a glossy folder and an eagerness that made her tired. She'd offered him coffee, listened for exactly 8 minutes, and then told him gently but completely without ambiguity that the Callaway land was not for sale, had never been for sale, and would not be for sale in any foreseeable future she could imagine. Pruitt had nodded, written something in his folder, and left. What she didn't know then, what Sylvia had only uncovered in the last 6 weeks while building the water rights case, was that Crawford Lyle had already retained a separate attorney to conduct a quiet title search on the Callaway property. He had done this without her knowledge. And what that attorney had flagged, buried in the county recorder's records from 1987, was a partial deed restriction clause that had never been properly recorded. A clerical error, essentially, from when Harriet's grandfather had subdivided a corner parcel and the paperwork had been filed wrong. It was, in isolation, almost nothing. A technical imperfection from 37 years ago that had never affected anything and that most courts would dismiss without ceremony. But in the hands of a skilled attorney with unlimited patience and a client with deep pockets, it was enough to cloud the title, enough to stall, enough to create uncertainty at exactly the moment when Harriet needed the title to be clean and clear for the Water Authority application. This was what Crawford was coming to tell her, not the offer. He was past offering now. He was coming to demonstrate leverage, coming to show her that her 3 days had already been shortened quietly from the other side. He stepped out of the truck in a grey canvas jacket and boots that had mud on them from somewhere else. He'd come from another property, she guessed, had probably started the day with another conversation he'd already won. He didn't look surprised to see her standing on the porch. He looked like a man who hadn't expected to need to look surprised. Mrs. Calloway. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. He didn't come up them. A choice, she noted. Territorial patience. Mr. Lyle? She held her coffee with both hands. You didn't call ahead. No, he said. I thought it was better to come in person. We're beyond letters, I think. Are we? He let the question sit for a moment, then reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. Not the full brief, just the summary sheet, she would learn later. He held it up but didn't hand it to her yet. I had a title search done on this property. Standard due diligence. My attorney found something that's going to need to be resolved before you can do anything significant with this land going forward. Conveyance, development, any kind of rights agreement. He paused there just a fraction of a beat, watching her face. Any of it. It'll all be tied up until the title question is addressed. Harriet looked at the document in his hand. She did not reach for it. She understood in the space of that single exchange exactly what he had done and exactly how precisely he had timed it. He had known or strongly suspected that she was close to something. He had moved to intercept. The question was, how much did he actually know? Did he know about the water rights applications specifically, or was he operating on instinct? The instinct of a man who had learned that widows on valuable land tended to get active around the 14-month mark, when the grief settled and the survival thinking kicked in. She breathed once, slow. Come inside, she said. I'll get you coffee. Because here was what Crawford Lyle did not know, could not know, had no mechanism to discover. 3 days ago, Harriet had called Sylvia and moved the application submission date up. It was now scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. She had already anticipated the title issue. Sylvia had found a resolution path for it 2 weeks earlier, a quiet deed correction filing that had been submitted to the county recorder 6 days ago and was already processing. Crawford had come to show her a problem she had already solved, but she was not going to tell him that. Not yet. Not until she understood what else he was holding. The kitchen was the realest room in the Calloway house. It had pine floors that had been refinished twice and would need it again in a few years. A window over the sink that looked east, so the morning light came in long and warm across the countertop. A table that seated 6, though Harriet mostly sat at one end of it now, the other 5 chairs existing in that particular purgatory of objects that haven't been reassigned since a person left. Edmund's chair was still at the head. She hadn't moved it. Crawford sat on the long side, not at the head, which she noted with something that was almost respect. He knew enough not to sit at the dead husband's chair. She poured coffee and sat across from him and waited. He laid the document on the table between them, smoothed it flat with one large hand, and talked for 7 minutes without stopping. And she gave him those 7 minutes completely, which seemed to surprise him slightly, because people who have something to hide usually interrupt. He explained the deed restriction clause, the 1987 filing error, the title cloud, and the timeline it would take to resolve through standard legal channels. Probably 8 to 10 months, his attorney estimated. Maybe longer if it needed to go before the court. There's a simpler path, he said, when he reached the end of the legal explanation. "I thought there might be," Harriet said. "You sell to me. I take on the title resolution as part of the transaction. You walk away clean, you walk away with good money, and you don't spend the next year fighting a paperwork problem in a county courthouse." Harriet looked at the document. "Can I hold on to this?" she asked. He blinked, just slightly. "That's my copy." "I know. Can I hold on to it?" A pause. Then he slid it across the table, a gesture of confidence. "I have more copies. I don't need that one." "How long have you been watching this property?" she asked. "I keep an eye on everything in the county." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It was not quite respect and not quite annoyance. Something in between that men like Crawford Lyle produced when a woman asked the question they'd been hoping to sidestep. 2 years, he said, give or take. Edmund was alive 2 years ago. Yes. Did he know you were watching? Crawford wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. We spoke once, at the feed auction in Lander, about 18 months before he passed. He wasn't interested in selling. No, he wouldn't have been. You're not him. The statement dropped into the kitchen like a stone into still water, and Harriet let the ripples spread before she answered. That's true, she said evenly. I'm not. She stood, moved to the counter, refilled her own coffee, though it didn't need it. Movement, something to do with her hands. Then she turned back and leaned against the counter and looked at Crawford Lyle with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent 14 months stripping everything unnecessary from her life and has arrived at a very clean understanding of what matters and what doesn't. I need a few days to look at this with my attorney, she said. Of course. I'll call your office by end of next week. Crawford nodded, stood, buttoned his jacket. He looked around the kitchen once, not snooping, more like a man performing an appraisal so natural he didn't notice he was doing it. The range, the cabinets, the window, the land visible through the glass. This is a hard place to run alone, he said, not unkindly. That was the most unsettling version of it, the lack of cruelty. He said it the way a doctor states a prognosis, factual, concerned even. Most things worth having are hard to run, Harriet said. He smiled, the real version briefly, before the professional version replaced it. Then he thanked her for the coffee and walked back through the house and out the front door, and she heard his truck start and turn in the gravel and head back down toward the gate. Harriet stood at the kitchen window and watched the dust settle. Then she picked up her phone and called Sylvia. He came in person, she said when Sylvia answered. How much does he know? He knows about the deed restriction. He doesn't know about the correction filing. I don't think he knows about the application. The correction processed yesterday afternoon, Sylvia said. I got the confirmation this morning. The title is clean as of 4 p.m. yesterday. Harriet closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. He came 12 hours too late, she said. 20 hours, actually. Sylvia's voice had a particular dry satisfaction in it that Harriet had come to deeply appreciate over these months. The application is ready. I can submit at 9 tomorrow morning as planned, or I can submit right now if you'd prefer. Submit now, Harriet said. She heard keys clicking on a keyboard through the phone. Submitted, Sylvia said. Timestamp 10:47 a.m., April 9th. Crawford Lyle's truck is still probably in your county. Harriet looked at the document he'd left on her kitchen table. The title search summary. His evidence of a problem that no longer existed. She thought about August, her father. The stubborn groan of the fence posts. She thought about Edmund, face down in the frost, hat blown 6 feet away. Thank you, Sylvia, she said. I'll let you know how the week unfolds. She hung up and stood there in the quiet kitchen for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the east pasture in a long silver wave, bending the grass all in one direction, then releasing it. The land didn't know what had just happened. It didn't need to. It was already hers. Morrow Flats had an unofficial town historian. A woman named Odette, who was 73 years old, ran the seed and hardware store that her family had operated since 1951 and had a memory for local events that bordered on supernatural. Harriet had known Odette her whole life, had sat on the worn wooden counter in that store as a little girl while Odette talked to August about spring planting schedules, had watched her father trust that woman's judgment on matters ranging from soil alkalinity to human character, and had absorbed, without ever being formally taught it, that Odette's read on a person was usually the most reliable instrument available in a 30-mile radius. She drove into town that afternoon. The bell over the seed store door made its familiar small sound, and Odette looked up from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who has been expecting you to arrive at approximately this time. "I heard Crawford Lyle's truck was out on your road this morning," Odette said. Harriet set her purse on the counter. "How did you hear that already?" "Bertram Hollis saw it from the highway, called his wife. His wife called Millicent from the flower shop. Millicent told me when she came in for potting soil." Odette folded her hands. "Welcome to Morrow Flats. What did he want? To tell me my title was clouded. Is it?" "It was. It isn't anymore." Odette studied her for a moment with those grey, unhurried eyes. "You've been working on something for 5 months. With Sylvia down in Cheyenne." Harriet paused. "How do you know about Sylvia?" "I don't know about Sylvia specifically. I know that a woman like you in your situation, with land like yours, does not stay quiet for 14 months out of grief alone. Grief lasts 3 months if you're lucky, then it becomes something you carry in one hand while you work with the other." "You've been working." Odette said it without judgment. It was simply an observation, stated the way she would state that the frost had broken early. "Crawford figured that out. That's why he came. He's going to be unpleasant when he realizes what I've done. Men like Crawford are unpleasant regardless. The difference is just the flavor." Odette moved around the counter and walked toward the small back office, a gesture of invitation. Harriet followed. They sat in the 2 ancient chairs that had been in that back room since before Harriet was born, and Odette poured 2 fingers of something amber into 2 small glasses from a bottle that lived in the bottom desk drawer, and Harriet took hers without asking what it was. "The water rights," Odette said. "Not a question. The aquifer. Edmund found it." "Edmund found a lot of things." Odette's voice softened just slightly. She had known Edmund since he was 12 years old. He just rarely got the credit. He would have figured out what to do with it eventually. "You figured it out faster." "I had more urgency," Harriet said. They sat with that for a moment. "Crawford has friends on the county commission," Odette said, returning to practical ground. "Lester Crane specifically. They've hunted together for 20 years. If the Water Authority application goes into review and Crawford finds out about it before the initial approval comes through, he may try to raise objections through Lester's office. Not outright opposition. He's too careful for that. But procedural delays, requests for additional environmental review, the kind of thing that costs months. Boone warned me about that. We structured the application to pre-address the environmental questions. It's thorough. Unusually thorough." "Good." Odette finished her drink. "You'll also want to speak with Ansel." Ansel Crow was the county recorder, had been for 19 years. He was a methodical, honest, deeply unsexy bureaucrat in the best possible sense of that term. He processed documents correctly, kept meticulous records, and had a particular mild contempt for people who tried to use his office as a tool for leverage. Harriet had already spoken with Ansel, twice, in the course of the past month. He knew the deed correction had been filed. He knew it had processed. He had even, unrequested, run a secondary confirmation that the original 1987 error had been fully remediated in the record. She told Odette this. Odette nodded slowly, and something in her face shifted, a relaxing, almost imperceptible. "Then you're in better shape than Crawford thinks you are," she said. "I'm in better shape than anyone thinks I am." Odette looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Harriet would think about for years afterward. "Your father used to say that the land doesn't respect ambition. It only respects patience." She set her glass down. "You've been patient, Harriet. You've been very patient." On the drive home, through that long, straight road with the mountains pressing blue and white against the western sky, Harriet thought about patience. about all the ways she had been patient that nobody saw, patient through Edmund's death, patient through the casseroles and the quiet knocks, patient through 6 months of letters from Crawford's office, patient through every well-meaning person in Morrow Flats who had looked at her with soft eyes and asked how she was managing. She had been managing fine. She had been managing something specific, in fact. The only variable she hadn't been able to fully control was Crawford's timing, the possibility that he would arrive at precisely the wrong moment and have precisely enough leverage to slow everything down. He had arrived at the wrong moment for himself. 12 hours after the title cleared, 20 minutes after the application submitted, she had not planned that margin. It had come down to luck and Sylvia's administrative efficiency, but it had held. Back at the ranch, she sat on the porch as the light went gold and then copper and then dark, watching the east pasture in the particular way she had developed over the past 14 months. Not the way of someone surveying their loss, but the way of someone learning all over again the exact dimensions of what they held. Tomorrow would bring complications. Crawford would find out, and when he did, he was not going to accept it quietly. Crawford found out on Friday. She didn't know the exact moment it happened, but she knew it had, because at 11:15 that morning, his personal number appeared on her phone. Not the assistant, not Pruitt, not another intermediary. His number. She let it go to voicemail. The message was professional, controlled, too controlled, in the way that a fire is too controlled when it's burning very hot but very deliberately. He said he had learned that she had submitted a water rights development application to the regional authority, and that he would appreciate a conversation at her earliest convenience. As there were aspects of this situation he believed she may not have fully considered. She called Sylvia first. "He's going to challenge the application," Sylvia said. "He'll file an adjacent landowner objection. He has standing because the Lyle holdings border the northeast corner of your property for about 400 yards. It's a narrow strip, but it's enough. How long does an objection add to the timeline? Properly handled? 30 to 60 days for a response hearing. Our application is strong enough that I don't anticipate we'd lose the review, but those 60 days matter. The Water Authority has a seasonal processing window. If we miss the spring cycle, we wait until fall." Harriet thought about that. Can he do anything beyond the objection? He can be unpleasant in the ways wealthy people are unpleasant. Expensive legal noise, basically. Depositions, document requests, procedural motions. None of it should be fatal to the application, but it's designed to be exhausting and expensive. Sylvia paused. He expected you to be neither ready nor resourced. He's recalibrating. What do I do about the 60 days? You could call him, Sylvia said. Hear what he wants. He may be willing to withdraw the objection in exchange for something. He wants the land. He wants something. It might not be exactly the land at this point. He's smart enough to know he's behind. He might want a piece of the water arrangement instead. This was a thought Harriet had been holding at arm's length all morning, examining it with the same careful attention she gave everything. Not dismissing it, not embracing it, just looking at it from different angles. There was a version of this where Crawford Lyle was not an adversary to be defeated, but a problem to be converted. A version where his money, his legal infrastructure, his relationships on the county commission became instruments that served her purpose rather than obstructed it. She didn't like that version, but she was honest enough to hold it. She called him back at 1 o'clock. "I appreciate the call," he said. She could hear in his voice that he had done something to his composure since the message, had shored it up, applied pressure to it from the inside. He was disciplined. She'd give him that. "You wanted a conversation," she said. "I'm available now. The application you submitted, it's more sophisticated than I expected." She said nothing. "The title correction was clean," he continued. "I reviewed it this morning. You filed it 6 days ago. You've been working on this for a while." "Edmund and I both have," she said. "He started it." A pause. "I respected Edmund," Crawford said, and she believed him, which made the situation stranger somehow, more human. Then you'll understand why I'm not going to sell his land. The objection I can file it, she said. A longer pause. Pardon? File the adjacent landowner objection. You have standing. It's your right. She kept her voice entirely level. I'll respond to it. Sylvia will respond to it. It'll add 30 or 60 days. I'll manage that. That's not... He stopped, reorganized. That's not how I expected this to go. I know. Most people in your position would want to avoid the delay. Most people in my position haven't been planning this for 5 months, Harriet said. I've built in buffer. File the objection if you feel it's warranted. But I want to be clear with you, Mr. Lyle. I'm not selling. I'm not making you a partner. I'm not reorganizing my application to accommodate your interests. The Callaway land has a plan, and the plan is moving forward. She let a brief silence pass. I told you that in 3 letters and 2 phone calls. I'm telling you in person now. Crawford was quiet for long enough that she wondered briefly if the call had dropped. Then he said, You know this makes things harder. Things were already hard, Harriet said. I've been managing hard for 14 months. I'm accustomed to it. Another silence. Something was happening on his end, some internal calculation she didn't have access to, some reassessment. She had the instinct not to fill the space. All right, he said finally. It was 2 words that carried about 17 different meanings, and she filed them all away to examine later. Good afternoon, Mr. Lyle. She hung up. Her hand, she noticed, was not shaking. She had been prepared for it to shake. It was completely still. She set the phone on Edmund's desk, the roll top, with its false bottom and its survey documents and its evidence of a man who had been looking ahead, and stood there for a moment, in the quiet of the house, in the particular afternoon light that came through the western windows this time of year, the kind of light that made everything look both ordinary and irreplaceable. Then she went outside to check on the horses, because they needed checking on, regardless of what was happening with water rights attorneys and ruthless ranchers, and because the land did not stop requiring attention just because the humans on it were in the middle of something consequential. That was one of the things she had loved most about Edmund. He always knew when to go check on the horses. Crawford filed the objection on the following Monday. It was formal, properly documented, and carefully crafted. His attorney had clearly worked the weekend. It raised 3 specific concerns: potential groundwater impact on adjacent Lyle Holdings infrastructure, questions about the hydrological survey methodology, and a request for expanded environmental review under state regulatory statute. Each concern was technically legitimate. None of them were fatal. All of them were designed to create maximum delay within the bounds of legal procedure. Sylvia called Harriet the moment she received the filing notification. It's good work, Sylvia said, in the tone of someone who can admire the architecture of a building, even when it's been constructed to obstruct her. He hired Aldridge and Moss out of Denver. They're very good. Can we respond within the window? We can respond in 10 days. I want to bring in 1 additional expert, a hydrologist who can address the survey methodology objection directly. Someone with credentials that will be difficult to dismiss. Do you have someone? I have Percy, Sylvia said. Harriet paused. Percy as in the hydrologist who talked to Edmund at the feed auction. Percy Wainwright. He's 70 years old. He's consulted on 40 water rights cases across the Mountain West. And he was the one who originally suggested this aquifer had regional significance. He's going to be a formidable witness. A brief pause. Also, I should mention, he already knows this case. He reached out to me 2 months ago when he heard through the Water Authority grapevine that an application was coming in for this section of the valley. He remembered Edmund. Something moved through Harriet's chest at that. Not quite grief, not quite gratitude, some third thing that didn't have a clean name. Get Percy, she said. The response hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out at the Water Authority's regional office in a town called Bridges Fork, 40 miles east of Morrow Flats. It was a smaller proceeding than a courtroom, a conference table, a hearing officer, attorneys for both parties, and expert witnesses. but it felt consequential in the way that small rooms with important papers always do. Harriet drove herself. She wore the dark green jacket she'd worn to August's funeral, which she had chosen deliberately, not out of ceremony, but because it had deep pockets, and she needed somewhere to put her hands during the moments when she needed to look like she wasn't thinking hard. Sylvia met her in the parking lot. Percy Wainwright was already inside. A short, compact man in his 70s, with a white beard and the careful eyes of someone who has spent decades reading things most people walk over without noticing. He shook Harriet's hand with both of his. "Edmund was right about this land," he said. "He was right about everything. I'm glad someone is seeing it through." The hearing lasted 4 hours. Crawford's attorneys were precise and thorough. They presented their 3 objections methodically, with visual displays and supporting documentation, and the hearing officer, a woman named Rosalind, who had the patient, undeceivable demeanor of someone who has heard every version of every argument, listened to all of it with an expression that revealed nothing. Then Sylvia presented the response. She was not flashy. She was the opposite of flashy. She was a woman who had done so much work that she could afford to be calm, the way a person who is packed carefully isn't anxious at the airport. She walked through the application's methodology point by point, the deed correction, the hydrological evidence, the environmental pre-clearance documentation. She was thorough in a way that felt almost gentle because there was no anxiety in it. And then Percy testified. He spoke for 40 minutes. He drew diagrams on a portable whiteboard that he had apparently brought from his car. He explained the aquifer system in terms that were precise without being inaccessible, and he addressed the survey methodology objection with the kind of direct, substantive authority that comes from someone who has been studying this particular question for 2 years and has, in fact, written 3 peer-reviewed papers on regional aquifer formations in this valley corridor. Crawford sat across the table in a grey suit, flanked by his attorneys, and Harriet watched him during Percy's testimony, watched the particular quality of stillness that settled over him as it became increasingly clear that he was not, in this room, in the stronger position. It was not a defeated stillness. Crawford Lyle was not a man who processed defeat simply. It was more like a recalculation, the stillness of a chess player who has just understood that the game they thought they were playing has 7 more moves than they accounted for, and that they are going to have to be genuinely careful now. The hearing officer asked questions. Good questions. She was clearly engaged, clearly paying attention, and her questions revealed a mind that was following the technical argument accurately and probing the genuine uncertainty points. She asked Percy about the seasonal flow variation data. She asked Sylvia about the adjacent land impact modeling. She asked Crawford's attorney to clarify the specific infrastructure concern on the Lyle Holdings northeast boundary. The answer to that last question was, ultimately, thin. Crawford's attorney did his professional best with it, but the concern, when stripped of the procedural language, boiled down to a hypothetical reduction in groundwater pressure at a bore well on the Lyle property that was, as Sylvia quietly noted in her counter, already documented as having suboptimal production, independent of any activity on the Callaway land. The hearing officer thanked all parties. She said she would issue a written determination within 15 business days. She did not indicate which direction she was leaning, but when Harriet walked out of that conference room into the parking lot of the Water Authority office, where the afternoon was cold and bright and the mountains were very clear to the west, she knew. She knew the way you know certain things in your body before your mind has caught up. The way August had known when rain was coming before the sky showed any sign of it. Something in the weight of the day, the quality of Rosalind's final question, the particular way Percy had answered it. It was going to be all right. Sylvia stood beside her, both of them looking at the mountains for a moment without speaking. "That was a strong performance," Sylvia said finally. "It wasn't a performance," Harriet said. "It was just the truth." "In my experience," Sylvia said, "the truth only looks that convincing when someone has prepared it very carefully." Harriet smiled. The real version, the one she mostly kept private. Crawford came out of the building 5 minutes later, his attorneys beside him, all three of them in conversation. He stopped when he saw Harriet. His attorneys kept walking to their car. He and Harriet stood in the parking lot, 12 feet apart, in the cold April afternoon. "Percy Wainwright," Crawford said, not quite admiring, not quite not. "Edmund met him at the feed auction," Harriet said. 18 months before he passed. Percy told him about the aquifer." Crawford looked at her steadily. "You've been building this since Edmund died," he said. "I've been building this since Edmund found the survey," she said. "I just had to wait until I understood it well enough to do it right." Crawford was quiet. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of sage and cold rock. "The objection withdrawal form," he said. "My attorney can file it before the determination comes through. It wouldn't change the outcome at this point, but it would register." Harriet looked at him. She understood what he was offering. Not a concession exactly, more like a gesture toward dignity, a way of not being on the losing side of the official record. "File it," she said, "if that's what you want to do." He nodded once, buttoned his jacket, looked at the mountains briefly, the same mountains she'd been looking at. "Your husband would have gotten there eventually," he said. "I know," Harriet said. "He always did." Crawford Lyle got in his truck and drove away. The Water Authority's written determination arrived on a Thursday, 11 business days after the hearing. Harriet was in the barn when Sylvia called. She walked out into the morning light with the phone pressed to her ear, and Sylvia read her the key paragraph in a voice that was professionally steady, but contained just underneath it something warm and genuine that Harriet had come to recognize in her over these months of shared work. "The objection filed by Crawford Lyle Consolidated Holdings has been reviewed and found insufficient to constitute grounds for denial or material delay of the application. The application by the estate of Edmund and Harriet Calloway for water rights development pursuant to regional aquifer access is hereby approved for entry into the development agreement process pending final survey confirmation." Harriet stood in the yard with the phone at her ear and the barn at her back and the east pasture stretching out gold and green in the April morning. "Harriet," Sylvia said after a moment. "I'm here," Harriet said. "Are you okay?" "Yes." She took a breath. "I'm very okay." She called Boone next because there was work to do. The development agreement process was a separate and substantial phase, and Boone knew that landscape better than anyone. He was warm and efficient and congratulatory in the brief way of people who consider completion an intermediate step rather than a destination. They scheduled a call for the following week. She called Odette. Odette said simply, "Good, your father would have liked this." Harriet thought about August, the pine resin, the black coffee, the fence posts groaning in the wind. She thought about how he had handed the land to her and Edmund on their wedding day with an expression that was not ceremonial, but practical, the expression of a man passing on something real and consequential and trusting the people receiving it to understand its weight. She thought about Edmund, in his careful way, commissioning the geological survey without telling anyone, sitting with the knowledge of what was under the land, the way you sit with a lamp in a dark house, not broadcasting it, just keeping the light steady. She thought about all the months she had been quiet, all the casseroles, all the soft eyes, all the people who had looked at her and seen a widow, a woman alone, a situation that would resolve itself eventually through the natural processes of grief and practical necessity, through sale or remarriage or some quiet surrender to the difficulty of running a place like this without a partner. None of them had been wrong exactly. It was hard. It was genuinely hard, every single day. They had just underestimated what hard could produce when the person enduring it had a clear purpose. Crawford Lyle's withdrawal form was filed 2 days after the determination. She saw the confirmation in the case file document Sylvia forwarded. No accompanying note, no communication, just the form correctly filed. A man honoring the gesture he had committed to quietly, the way certain people honor things when they think nobody is watching. She filed it carefully in the roll-top desk, in the same drawer where Edmund's original survey documents lived. The land was hers. The water rights were in process. The plan had worked. Spring came to the Callaway spread 12 months later with the particular generosity of years that follow hard ones. The development agreement had been finalized the previous autumn, a 40-year water rights partnership with the regional authority, structured to ensure that the Callaway land remained intact and operational as a working ranch while generating a sustained revenue stream from managed aquifer access. It was not a windfall. It was not the kind of thing that changed who you were overnight, or made you careless with money, or gave you reason to do anything differently in the immediate daily sense. It was the kind of thing that meant the ranch would not be sold. Not in Harriet's lifetime, not in the lifetime of whoever came after her, if she organized the trust correctly, which Sylvia was helping her do. It was permanence, essentially, or as close to permanence as land arrangements ever got. She had made 2 changes to the property in the year since. She'd repaired the northeast fence line, which had been needing attention since before Edmund died, and she had put in a proper irrigation setup on the south pasture, which Percy had recommended, and which was already showing results in the quality of the summer grazing. She had not remarried. She was not lonely in the way people assumed widows were lonely. She was, in fact, quite comfortable with her own company in a way she suspected had been true of her for a long time, and that Edmund, who was also comfortable with his own company, had understood about her and loved. Boone came up in April to review the first year's agreement performance, and they sat at the kitchen table, not Edmund's end, not Crawford's side, but the window side where the morning light came in, and he spread the documents out and walked her through the numbers and told her in his quiet way that it was tracking well above the conservative estimates. Edmund would have been happy with this, Boone said. Edmund would have already been on to the next thing, Harriet said. Boone laughed, a real one, brief and surprised. Probably. Percy came up in May, not for professional reasons but personal ones. He drove the 4 hours from his home in Sheridan simply because, as he explained it, he had a habit of visiting places where he'd done meaningful work, and the Callaway Aquifer was some of the most meaningful work of his later career. He walked the property with Harriet for 2 hours, the old hydrologist and the rancher, talking about water tables and land formation and the particular way time moves through geological structures versus the way it moves through human ones. "Water doesn't go anywhere," Percy said at one point, standing at the edge of the north pasture, looking down at the valley. "It just becomes different things. Snow, then melt, then groundwater, then vapor, then snow again. The same water, cycling. People think of it as a resource, meaning something you use up. It's not. It's a relationship." Harriet thought about that for a long time afterward. She thought about it in the way she thought about things she didn't have a complete answer to yet, holding it lightly, bringing it back occasionally, letting it mean new things as circumstances changed. She had not heard from Crawford Lyle since the parking lot outside the Water Authority office. She did not expect to. Men like Crawford moved on to available territory, not because they were cavalier about losing exactly, but because forward motion was the only mode they had fully developed. He had other land, other negotiations, other properties he was circling. She did not wish him ill. She did not think about him much. What she thought about, mostly, was the ranch, its fences and seasons, and the specific sounds it made at different times of day and night. The horses, the east pasture in morning light, the roll-top desk with its false bottom, where she kept Edmund's survey and Crawford's withdrawn objection and her father's last letter to her, folded small and soft from many years of being occasionally reopened and read. The land didn't know what had happened in its name. It didn't know about the attorneys and the hearing and the development agreement. It didn't know that a man had come with documents designed to take it and gone home without what he came for. It was just land. It asked for patience. It asked for early mornings and calloused hands and the particular kind of silence that only people who've buried someone nearby can truly understand. Harriet understood it. She always had. Here's what I want you to take from this story. Not the legal mechanics, not the water rights, or the deed restrictions, or the development agreements. What I want you to take is the image of a woman standing at a kitchen window, watching a black truck come through her gate, and not flinching, because she had done the work before the truck arrived. That's all it ever is. That's the thing nobody talks about when they tell stories about triumph and difficulty. The long, quiet, invisible work that happens before the confrontation, before the dramatic moment, before the person who thought they had the leverage walks into the room and finds out, slowly and then all at once, that the ground has already shifted. Harriet didn't win because she was lucky. She didn't win because Crawford made a mistake, or because the legal system worked out in a clean and satisfying way, or because good things happened to good people. She won because, when everyone around her was seeing a widow, a woman alone, a situation in decline, she was seeing a plan. And she executed it with patience and precision and the particular kind of quiet ferocity that people who have lost something real discover when they decide not to lose anything more. Edmund started it. Percy identified it. Sylvia built the legal structure. Boone mapped the path. Odette held context. Ansel kept the records honest, but Harriet held it together. Harriet was the center of gravity around which all of it organized itself. She was the plan. That's the part that stays with me. Thank you for spending this hour here. If this story reached you in a place that matters, leave a comment. I read them. Hit like if you made it to the end. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And take care of whatever land you're standing on. I'll see you in the next story.